Hi everyone, so today I'll be presenting about Robert H. Frank's book about success and luck, good fortune and the myth of meritocracy. Sometimes in our own lives, we often perceive luck as a non-factor in determining our success, and that hard work and expertise determine our overall life trajectory more. While it is not necessarily false, this book explains that it is not always the case.
Frank argued that luck influences our fortunes in life more than we previously think. The fact is, every biggest winner in today's hyper-competitive environment, either in business, sports, or even academics, would at some point in their lives catch lucky breaks that allow them to separate themselves from the rest of the pack. People's perception of luck also influences their judgment, motivation, and behavior in the workplace immensely. In addition, recognizing the importance of luck will also be beneficial for us as a society in the long run. This is very important for us OB students, because one of the purposes of studying this unit is to be able to understand the reasoning behind people's motivation and behavior, and also to understand the driving process behind people's judgment and decision making, with the hopes of eventually becoming effective leaders ourselves. People's judgment, decision making, and their ability to attribute the causes behind the success or failure of their actions, and even motivation, are heavily influenced by their perception of luck. Therefore, this topic is of high importance to us because it explains a lot about people's behavior at the workplace and the extent to which luck-induced biases affect people's judgment and decision-making. One of the main ideas that I learned is that we all live in a winner-takes-all society. This means that it is increasingly common for one company or individual to monopolize an entire industry. It is due to the fact that technological advances have increased the reach of the best-performing companies. For instance, local retailers and department stores are going out of business as giants like Amazon take over their market share. This example shows that local, geographically isolated inferior companies are now redundant, as customers are now granted access to the best companies in the world.
The implication of this development is that the market for that industry is becoming even more competitive, since the financial rewards get bigger and bigger, while at the same time the quota for the so-called winners get smaller. And in such environments, where every competitor is almost as equally hardworking as one another, the merit gap between them is tiny. This is where luck plays a huge part. The winners of this competition would need a lucky break to distance themselves from the rest of the competition, and since there is only enough place to fit one winner, the financial rewards between being first and second is enormous, far larger than what their skill gap indicates. This is quite a new thing for me to grasp, because thus far I have largely believed that higher efforts would always equate to higher rewards. For example, Microsoft became the most valuable company on earth, while at the same time almost driving Apple, one of their biggest rivals, into bankruptcy in the 90s, even though on paper their GUI quality is virtually equal. In this case, Microsoft got a lucky break from both Apple and IBM, which propelled them ahead of the pack. IBM somehow allowed Gates to retain ownership of MS-DOS, and at the same time, there was an internal rift inside Apple which led to Steve Jobs' departure. Had these two events not happened, it is hard to imagine Microsoft as the giant it is today, and thus it showed that little amount of luck could amplify into huge differences in financial rewards. Another fascinating idea from this book is that people's belief about luck actually influences their behavior, motivation, and decision making. This is very interesting because I've always thought of luck as a negligible thing and have no effect on my behavior. However, instead, luck turned out to play a much bigger role than I previously thought. So the idea is that it is argued that evolution has shaped human nature to be oriented towards problem solving. Therefore, we tend to recognize and remember our problems more than our lucky breaks. For instance, when playing poker, we find it much easier to recall our bad beats than to remember our cards hitting a 3-outer at the river. This leads a bias called availability heuristic, which means that we tend to rely on information which we can recall from our memory the easiest, which leads us to draw wrong conclusions. Since we tend to recall our hardships more, we often forget the moments where we are extremely lucky. Subsequently, this leads people to forget luck's role in their success, and they start being overconfident. Overconfidence bias asserts that people become too sure about their judgments. It also leads people to think that they have more control of their circumstances. For instance, when we play baccarat at casino, most of my friends legitimately believe that the way they open their cards will determine the numbers that will show on their cards. When the cards indeed turned out to be the cards they wanted, they will attribute it to their skill and hard work, even though we all know that it is purely dumb luck. However, ignoring luck and becoming overly proud of your success might actually motivate you. By believing that your own efforts would determine your own success, people would be more willing to put effort in their work when things get rough. So, being overconfident is actually an important source of motivation. The opposite is also true, however. People who believe in luck would be more tempted to just sit back and see how luck plays out instead when things get tough. Therefore, through this chain of events, we can understand that decision-making and motivation is heavily influenced by luck. Another interesting idea from this book is that successful people need to recognize luck's role more in order to create a better future for the society. This means that wealthy people tend to attribute their success to their own hard work and feel entitled to their wealth, as explained by the overconfidence theory earlier. Thus, they are usually not keen on paying taxes. However, what they don't realize is that being born into a wealthy nation with world-class infrastructure is one of the luckiest things that can happen to you. For instance, the chance of making it big in absolute terms in Zimbabwe is much smaller than in America. The author said that if those people recognize the importance of luck more, they would be more inclined to pay taxes, since it is taxes that allowed them to be so lucky in the first place. However, even if those wealthy people do recognize luck, they would still tend to believe that a raise in taxes would mean a reduction in their personal income. It is not entirely true though. The author argued that adopting a so-called progressive consumption tax would not hurt the rich, as this would lower the standards across the board and the rich would still be able to afford the best that society can offer, relatively speaking. This idea changed my perception about taxes, to be honest, because I too have always thought that a raise in taxes is equal to an individual loss of income. But as it turned out, it is not always the case, because other people's income will also be affected, and that would cause a change in what is defined as the standard. All in all, this argument showed that while recognizing luck would benefit the society in the long term, through more willingness in paying higher taxes. Aside from its fascinating content, I've also found some parts to be rather questionable. Firstly, I personally believe that the author is using the term luck too loosely. What this suggests is that some events that the author stated as pure luck might not be luck related at all. For instance, the author said that successful actors often have to be really lucky. He argued as such because famous actors like Al Pacino and Bryan Cranston somehow got lucky because the directors of The Godfather and Breaking Bad respectively chose them specifically, and that it is an external factor that has nothing to do with them and their expertise in the field of acting. However, I would argue that successful people are usually highly skillful in more than one field. Successful businessmen, for instance, are not just experts in calculating costs, investments, and debts. They are also experts at making connections, communicating ideas, public speaking, making the right impressions to people, leading and managing people, etc. The same can be said for actors. It is their own people and connection skills that allow them to be specifically favored by directors. Therefore, to improve upon this flaw, I would suggest that the author should have explicitly explained what actually is meant by luck, and what do events need to involve to be called as luck. With a definitive answer, readers could hopefully draw a solid line between what is considered as luck and what is not. Another flaw that I found is that the author does not use his concept of relative positions consistently. What this idea means is that the author often measures things in absolute terms, even though he repeatedly asserts that success and wealth should be measured in relative terms. This is most evident in the section where he argued that taxes are not harmful for the rich because relatively speaking they would still be the richest of the society. However, when he argued that wealthy people would not be as successful in poor countries, he heavily implied that success is measured in absolute terms, indicating that those people would not be making billions of dollars had they been born in those countries. I would instead argue that if the author is so determined in convincing the rich that wealth and success is measured in relative terms, in other words, to get them to pay more taxes, he should not have used absolute terms when trying to convince those same rich people that they wouldn't be as successful had they been born in Zimbabwe. The thing is, relatively speaking, the most hardworking and lucky people would still be very successful, relatively speaking. Also, the example that he used about a highly skilled Nepalese worker who were unable to make it simply because he was unlucky enough to be born in Nepal is highly anecdotal. In developed societies, there are also plenty of skilled labor who are living a life of misery. Therefore, to amend these mistakes, I would suggest that the author should have used relative positioning consistently throughout his argument, and not make exceptions to advance his narrative. That way, readers are more likely to accept his arguments. There are several pieces of advice that we can all learn from this book. Since we are all OB students, we are well acquainted with the concepts of biases in decision making. Therefore, by understanding the relationship between the importance of luck and our ability to attribute causes, we can learn more about biases, such as availability heuristics and overconfidence. Ultimately, it is hoped that once we identify our biases, we can eliminate them, and thus, in the long run, we can make more well-informed and objective decisions in our daily and academic lives. Secondly, as OP students ourselves, we need to acknowledge that ignoring luck can sometimes be beneficial for us, as it could be an important source of motivation. However, it is an ephemeral source of motivation. Once we hit a point where we have worked our absolute best but the results that we get do not match our expectation, it is very easy for us to slip into hopelessness and depression. Thus, it would be wise for us to embrace things more realistically. For starters, we should find a more objective and perpetual source of motivation, such as by choosing a subject or career we are innately passionate about. That way, our motivation can remain constant for a much longer duration, and in the long run would translate into better, more consistent results. Lastly, it is also equally as important for us to realize that we are living in a winner-takes-all society, either in uni or in later life. The barrier to achieve success gets increasingly higher. However, by understanding that luck sometimes determines the winner, we should not be dissuaded from working harder than other people. Instead, by realizing that a winner often gets the lion's share, we OP students should be more committed to work harder than other people, because we now realize that the market is becoming very competitive. After all, we should understand that if we are more expert than other people, we still have a better chance than other people at achieving success, regardless of luck. And if we do lose out, we can come to terms with it quickly because we realize that we are just unlucky, and then we can try again without any burden on our minds. Thank you.